The busy street was alive with noise, cars rushing, people laughing, vendors shouting. Yet in the middle of that chaos stood a fragile young girl with tangled hair, torn clothes, and a guitar nearly falling apart. She held a small cardboard sign that read, "Can I play for food?" Instead of compassion, she was met with ridicule. People whispered, sneered, and even laughed at her audacity. A homeless girl wanting to play music? Impossible. But within seconds, when her trembling fingers touched the strings, the entire crowd that mocked her would be silenced, and their hearts would shatter into tears. The city streets were alive with chaos that evening, honking horns, the chatter of strangers, the laughter of friends rushing to dinner. Yet amid that restless noise stood a girl who seemed invisible to most eyes. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn and dirt-stained, and her shoes were worn out to the point of nearly falling apart. She looked no older than 16, maybe 17, yet her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived lifetimes of pain. In her hands, she clutched something even more fragile than herself, an old guitar. The wooden body was scratched, the strings mismatched, some rusting, some nearly snapping. Yet she held it as though it were the most precious thing she owned, the only piece of dignity she could still call her own. At her feet lay a cardboard sign, carefully written in shaky handwriting, "Can I play for food?" Some people glanced at it and smirked. Others ignored it entirely, walking past as though the girl were nothing more than a shadow on the pavement. A group of teenagers stopped, their mocking laughter sharp and cruel. "Play for food? What is she, some kind of street clown?" One of them sneered. Another added, "Bet she doesn't even know how to play. She just wants pity." The girl's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she stayed silent. She had heard it all before, the insults, the doubt, the scorn. Hunger gnawed at her stomach like a beast. But the deeper hunger was for kindness, for someone to believe she was worth listening to. A man in a crisp suit carrying a leather briefcase slowed down just long enough to sneer. "You're young, strong. Stop begging and get a job like everyone else. Playing that broken guitar won't get you anywhere." His words were sharp as knives, and the people around him chuckled as though he had just spoken some undeniable truth. The girl didn't argue. She simply lowered her head, gripping her guitar tighter. Her throat tightened, not just from hunger, but from the weight of being unseen, unheard, and unvalued. Then, with trembling hands, she lowered herself onto the cold pavement. She took a deep breath, as though summoning every ounce of courage left inside her. The world around her seemed too loud, too fast, too cruel, but in that moment all she had was her music. Her fingers hovered over the strings. They trembled, not from fear alone, but from weakness, the kind that came from days without proper food. She closed her eyes, blocking out the jeers, the mocking faces, the businessman's disdain, and then she strummed the first chord. The sound was unexpected. Though the guitar was broken, the note that came out was rich, deep, and haunting. It seemed to cut through the noise of the busy street like a blade of light piercing darkness. People who had been walking briskly slowed down. Some turned their heads, surprised that such a sound could come from such a fragile-looking girl and such a battered instrument. Her voice followed, soft at first, quivering like a candle flame in the wind. But as the words flowed, it grew steadier, stronger. It was not the voice of a beggar. It was the voice of someone who had stories locked inside her heart, stories begging to be heard. The melody wrapped itself around the crowd like an invisible thread, tugging gently but firmly at their hearts. The teenagers who mocked her fell silent. One of them, still holding a phone mid-laugh, slowly lowered it as though ashamed. The businessman, halfway across the street, paused. His footsteps faltered. For the first time in years, perhaps, something other than money caught his attention. The girl kept singing, eyes closed, lost in her own world. Her song was not about wealth or glamour. It was about longing, hunger, dreams she once had, and the crushing weight of loneliness. She sang of sleeping under bridges when rain fell, of holding onto a broken guitar as if it were a lifeline, of remembering her mother's lullabies long after her mother was gone. Her fingers moved with grace, as though the guitar itself had been waiting all this time for her touch. The notes came alive, weaving a tapestry of raw emotion, unpolished yet pure. The street, once filled with chatter and laughter, grew quiet. Even the vendors who usually shouted over each other to sell their goods lowered their voices, caught in the spell of her music. A child holding her mother's hand tugged gently and whispered, "Mama, she sings like an angel." The mother, her eyes glistening, nodded silently. The air itself seemed to shift. The mocking laughter was gone. The scorn had vanished. What remained was awe, raw and unfiltered, spreading from one listener to another like ripples in water. And all the while the girl played, not for applause, not for fame, not for recognition. She played because it was all she had left to give. She played because in every note she poured her hunger, her hope, her heartbreak. She played because, for a few moments, the world had to stop and see her not as a homeless girl, not as a beggar, but as a human being with a soul too beautiful to be ignored. By the time the last note of that first song lingered in the air, silence had fallen completely. And in that silence, every heart listening knew they were witnessing something rare, something unforgettable. The first song faded into silence, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. The crowd that had gathered stood frozen, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Then, almost timidly, the girl's fingers touched the strings again. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were still closed, her expression focused, as though she was lost in a place only she could see. And then she began her second song. This time the melody was gentler, slower, like a whispered confession. Her voice trembled with vulnerability but carried strength underneath, a strength forged in hardship. The lyrics weren't complicated. They didn't speak of grand adventures or rich luxuries. Instead, they spoke of hunger, of loneliness, of nights spent staring at the sky and wondering if anyone cared whether she lived or died. Each word pierced through the air like an arrow straight into the hearts of her listeners. Strangers who had never noticed her before now felt as though they had known her all their lives. A young woman in the crowd pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. An old man removed his hat, lowering his head out of respect, as though listening to a prayer. The businessman who had mocked her earlier stood rooted in place. His face, once hard and dismissive, softened with every note. Memories of his own childhood stirred, of the mother who used to sing to him, of the father who had once told him, "Never judge a man until you've walked in his shoes." He suddenly realized he had done exactly that, judged without knowing, ridiculed without understanding. A lump formed in his throat, and he looked down at the pavement ashamed. The teenagers who had laughed were no longer laughing. One of them, guilt burning on his face, pulled out a small packet of chips from his backpack and placed it near the girl's feet without saying a word. Another fumbled in his pocket for a few coins, his hands shaking not from cold but from remorse. They had mocked her weakness, only to discover her strength was greater than theirs. As the song went on, people who had been walking by began to stop. A woman carrying grocery bags dropped them accidentally, her eyes locked on the girl as though hypnotized. Fruits rolled across the pavement, but she didn't care. She pulled out her phone and started recording, whispering to no one in particular, "The world needs to see this." Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see the girl playing. Little faces, innocent and untainted by cynicism, beamed with pure admiration. One child clapped out of rhythm, smiling widely, while another leaned forward, eyes wide with wonder, as if seeing magic for the first time. The girl's fingers moved as though they had a life of their own. Despite the guitar's cracks and broken strings, the sound was mesmerizing, echoing with a richness that no modern instrument could replicate. It was raw, unpolished, but more beautiful than perfection, because it was real. Every note told her story, every strum carried her soul, and the people listened, truly listened. For once, they didn't hear just a homeless girl on the street. They heard a survivor, an artist, a soul too powerful to be broken by hunger or circumstance. Her music became a mirror, reflecting back the emotions buried in each of them. Loneliness they had felt, but never spoken. Pain they had hidden behind smiles. Dreams they had long abandoned. Some cried silently, their tears streaking down their cheeks. Others held hands with the strangers next to them, as though united by the invisible thread of her song. The busy street, usually filled with rushing and noise, transformed into something sacred, a place of connection, compassion, and truth. One man, standing at the edge of the crowd, whispered to himself, "How many times have I walked past her? How many times have I turned away?" He wiped his eyes, his chest heavy with guilt. The girl's voice soared in the final chorus, cracking slightly from exhaustion, but still carrying an unshakable power. She wasn't just singing a song, she was pleading with the world to see her, to remember her, to believe that even in brokenness, beauty exists. Her voice echoed against the buildings, rising above the city's noise, demanding to be heard. When the last note hung in the air, the crowd was utterly still. It was the kind of silence that comes after something sacred, something unforgettable. A silence so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. And in that silence, hearts that had once been hard cracked open. People who had mocked her moments ago now stood with tears streaming down their faces, humbled by the depth of her gift. The young girl opened her eyes at last, glancing nervously at the crowd. She didn't expect applause. She didn't expect kindness. She had been mocked too many times before. All she expected was more silence, maybe another cruel remark, maybe someone telling her to leave. But instead, she saw something she had never seen before. Faces filled with admiration, respect, and compassion. People wiping their eyes. Children smiling up at her. Strangers looking at her not as a beggar, not as a homeless girl, but as someone extraordinary. And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. The last note of her song faded into the night air like a whisper carried by the wind. For a heartbeat, everything was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, sacred, unforgettable. Then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Hands clapped, voices cheered, and the very people who had mocked her only minutes before now shouted words of praise, their faces wet with tears they hadn't expected to shed. The girl blinked in disbelief. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Applause? For her? She had grown used to being ignored, ridiculed, and brushed aside. The sound of clapping was so foreign to her that she almost didn't know how to react. She held her guitar close, her lips trembling as if to form words, but no sound came out. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, people stepped forward. A young woman knelt and placed a sandwich wrapped in foil at the girl's feet. "Eat, sweetheart," she whispered with a shaky smile. A teenager who had mocked her earlier put his coins in the guitar case and mumbled, "I'm sorry, you're amazing." His friends followed, each of them dropping something, a bottle of water, a snack, whatever little they had. Their earlier arrogance had melted into humility. The businessman who had sneered at her before stood motionless, his eyes glassy. Slowly he reached for his wallet. Unlike the coins and snacks others had given, he pulled out crisp bills and placed them carefully inside her guitar case. But he didn't just walk away. He crouched down so he could look her in the eyes. His voice, once sharp and dismissive, was now soft and filled with regret. "I was wrong about you. I judged you without knowing your story. Forgive me. You deserve more than food. You deserve a stage." The girl's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her chest. Her eyes filled with tears instead. By now the crowd had grown large, with people circling around, phones out, capturing the moment. But the videos weren't just about showing off what they had witnessed. They were about sharing something the world desperately needed to see. Raw talent, resilience, and the reminder of how wrong it is to judge someone by their appearance. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked loudly, "Mama, is she famous?" The mother smiled through her tears and whispered, "Not yet, sweetheart. But she should be." The girl strummed her guitar again, hesitantly at first, as if testing whether the moment was real. The crowd immediately grew silent, eager for more. This time she played not for food, not even for survival, but because for the first time, people wanted to listen. Her music filled the air once more, softer now, like a lullaby wrapping itself around the hearts of everyone present. As she sang, the businessman pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was urgent but hopeful. "You need to come here. Right now. You won't believe what I've found." He wasn't talking about a business deal, nor a financial opportunity. He was talking about her. About the girl who had stopped an entire street with nothing but a broken guitar and a voice full of truth. By the end of her third song, donations had piled up in front of her. Food, money, jackets, even a warm blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. But more than the material gifts, what she received was priceless. Dignity, respect, and the chance to be seen as more than her circumstances. The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I just wanted to be heard." The crowd cheered again, louder than before. Some people were crying openly now, strangers holding strangers, bound together by the power of her music. The teenagers who had laughed at her were now her biggest admirers, urging her to never stop singing. The businessman who had insulted her promised to help her find a real stage, a real audience, where the world could hear the gift she carried inside. In that moment, the girl wasn't just a homeless child with a guitar. She was a reminder, a living lesson that behind every face you overlook could be a story waiting to change your heart. That night, she didn't go hungry. That night, she didn't sleep on the street alone. That night, she went to bed with a full stomach, a warm blanket, and something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Her music had done more than feed her body. It had awakened compassion in hearts that had forgotten how to feel. And as the video spread online, as thousands more watched her sing from behind their screens, tears fell across the world. People shared her story, not just because she was talented, but because she was a beacon of truth. Never again would those who heard her name look at a homeless child the same way. Never again would they dismiss someone by the dirt on their clothes or the weakness in their hands. They would remember her voice, her courage, and the way she transformed mockery into awe. And as for the girl, she finally realized what she had always hoped deep down, that even in the darkest corners of the world, beauty can shine. That even when life strips you of everything, if you still have your voice, your truth, your gift, you have enough to move mountains. The night ended with the crowd slowly dispersing, their hearts forever changed. But the echo of her song lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary souls are hidden in the most ordinary places. And the lesson was clear: never mock the broken, never doubt the unseen. Because sometimes the one you ignore has the power to make the world weep and then heal.